The snow fell in heavy, silent sheets that morning, blanketing the small town of Ridgefield in a cold white hush. Inside Molly's diner, the smell of bacon and coffee, mixed with the sound of clinking plates and a scratchy old jukebox, playing a tune from the 60s. At a corner booth sat Frank Delaney, 81 years old, a Vietnam veteran, his frail hands trembling slightly as he stirred sugar into his coffee. His worn army jacket, faded by time and pride, rested on the back of the seat. He came here every morning, not for the food, but for the company, for the simple rhythm of life that made him feel human again. But that day, something dark and ugly broke that peace. Before we go any further, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and standing up for what's right, please take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to KindHeartsHub. Every story we tell here reminds us that humanity still shines brightest when the world goes dark. Frank was halfway through his toast when the diner door slammed open with a violent thud. A young man stormed in, tall, wiry, his leather jacket dripping from the snow, eyes burning with something more than anger. His name was Trevor, a 26-year-old troublemaker the town had whispered about for years. He'd fallen into bad company, quick tempers, and quicker violence. He didn't care about much anymore, except showing the world he wasn't afraid of anyone. When he spotted Frank sitting alone, old and quiet, something cruel flickered across his face. Maybe it was the uniform jacket. Maybe it was the calmness in Frank's eyes that reminded him of everything he wasn't. He walked over, mumbling curses, accusing Frank of staring at him. The diner went silent. Frank looked up, tired but calm, saying softly that he meant no disrespect. But Trevor's anger wasn't about that moment. It was about everything that had gone wrong in his own life. In a sudden flash of rage, he raised his hand and slapped the old man across the face. The sound cracked through the diner like a gunshot. Plates froze in midair, forks stopped. The waitress gasped. And Frank just sat there, eyes wide, lips trembling. He didn't fight back. He didn't even speak. He just looked down, as a tear traced a line through the wrinkles of his weathered cheek. For a long second, nobody moved. Then the bell above the diner door jingled again. A gust of cold wind swept in, along with the sound of heavy boots. Everyone turned. The man who walked in filled the doorway with his presence, leather vest covered in patches, long gray beard, eyes sharp as knives. Behind him, 3 more bikers followed, each wearing the unmistakable red and white insignia of the Hells Angels. The first man looked around, his gaze landing on Frank, then on the young thug standing over him. And then his voice broke the silence. "Dad?" Frank looked up slowly. "Tommy," he whispered. It was his son, Tom Delaney, the president of the local Hells Angels chapter. The room held its breath. Trevor's face went pale. He took a step back, suddenly realizing the gravity of what he'd done. But it was too late. The other bikers had already surrounded him, their presence suffocating the air. Tom walked toward the booth, his fists clenched, his jaw trembling, not from anger alone, but from the sight of his father, the man who had once taught him how to ride a bicycle, sitting there with a red mark across his face. The contrast between the old soldier and his outlaw son was stark. One wore a life of discipline and honor, the other, a life of rebellion and defiance. But in that moment, both hearts beat with the same fire. Tom stopped in front of Trevor, inches away, his voice low and deadly calm. "You put your hand on my father?" The thug stammered, trying to explain, but no words came. The bikers' boots echoed softly as they shifted closer, like a pack waiting for their leader's command. The waitress whispered, begging Tom not to do something he'd regret. But Frank reached out, his trembling hand resting on his son's arm. "Tommy," he said quietly, "let it go." The words hung heavy in the air. Tom's chest heaved, his knuckles were white. "He hit you, Dad." Frank's voice cracked, but there was steel in it. "And if you hit him back, what makes you any different?" The entire diner went silent again. Even Trevor froze, his shame plain in his eyes. The old man's words, spoken through pain, cut deeper than any punch ever could. Tom looked down at his father, tears glistening in the corners of his eyes. Slowly, he stepped aside, signaling his men to stand down. "Apologize," he said quietly. Trevor swallowed hard. I'm sorry," he muttered. But Frank shook his head. "No, son. Look me in the eye when you say it." Trevor did, and for the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, he saw the weight of his own choices reflected in someone else's pain. His voice broke as he said it again. "I'm sorry, sir." Frank nodded slowly, then motioned for him to sit. "You got family?" he asked. The young man hesitated, then shook his head. "Not anymore," he whispered. Frank looked at him for a long time, then did something no one expected. He asked the waitress for another cup of coffee and pushed it across the table. "Then sit down," he said. "You do now." the diner filled with quiet murmurs as everyone tried to process what they'd just witnessed. The Hells Angels, men known for their toughness, stood still, humbled by the strength of a frail old man who refused to answer hate with hate. Tom sat beside his father, staring at him like he was seeing him for the first time. He realized that true strength wasn't in fists or fear, it was in forgiveness. That small moment changed everything. Trevor started coming back to the diner every morning, at first just to say thank you, then to help. He started washing dishes, fixing broken chairs, and eventually he stopped drinking. Frank became something of a mentor to him, teaching him discipline, kindness, and dignity through the quiet stories of his own battles. And Tom, though hardened by his life on the road, began to see his father in a new light. He brought the Angels by sometimes, not for intimidation, but to share coffee and stories with the man who'd shown them all what real courage looked like. Weeks later, word spread through the town, not of the violence, but of the forgiveness that followed. People who once feared the Angels now saw them differently. They began volunteering, helping at veteran centers, even organizing charity rides. And at the heart of it all was Frank, the old veteran who had turned a moment of hate into a lesson in humanity. One snowy morning, several months later, Frank passed away peacefully in his sleep. The diner filled to bursting for his memorial. Bikers, townspeople, waitresses, and even Trevor stood shoulder to shoulder. On the counter, his old army jacket rested neatly folded, a note tucked inside. It takes more strength to forgive than to fight. Chooses forgiveness over hate.